Hello, this is Mike, and welcome to another episode of Urban Legends and Mythology. That little recorded sound loop you heard at the intro came from the late, great Robert Johnson. I touched on his story a little bit at the end of the Season 1 episode, The 27 Club, and I feel like his story really needs its own episode all to itself because this is a man whose entire life is shrouded in mystery and folklore and urban legend. So without further ado, this is the life of Robert Johnson, the legendary blues man who laid the earliest foundations of rock and roll as we know it. So let's take a sip of this delicious Rheingeist truth and get into it. So Robert Johnson, a name who is synonymous with blues. His music made him one of the most iconic founders of his genre. 29 songs, only 2 recorded photographs, and as I said before, a life shrouded in mystery. So, as always on this show, let's start at the beginning. So, Robert Johnson was born in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, most likely on May 8th, 1911, to Julia Major Dodds and Noah Johnson. Now, Julia was married to a man named Charles Dodds, so Robert was born out of wedlock. And many state that he never actually met his actual father. However, Charles Dodds still raises him as his own, and actually, he was a prosperous landowner in the area. However, this being the rural South in the early 1910s, at one point he was actually forced by a lynch mob to leave, so they leave the Hazelhurst area following a dispute with these local landowners. And they eventually end up in Memphis, and at this time, his mother actually is raising him as Robert Spencer. He ends up going to the Carnes Avenue Colored School, which, this was segregation, so he went to a colored school. So he got a very basic education. And it was during this childhood in Memphis where he discovers an affinity, a love for blues music. However, it is suggested that he took his studies seriously because the quality of his signature actually suggests that he was a well-educated person. And considering the quality of education you would get at the time, being a black child in the South, in the segregated South, where, education standards are like barely above literacy, it really just goes to show that he took it seriously. So at around the age 19, his mother actually tells him about his biological father, and this is when he adopts his surname as Robert Johnson. And he actually uses the name Robert Johnson on his marriage certificate when he marries his first wife, the 16-year-old Virginia Travis, in 1929. However, she unfortunately died in childbirth about a year into their marriage. So here we are. He's 20 years old. He's coming from a rural, poor, black background in the rural South, and he's already a widower. However, he does have this affinity for blues music, and it's that affinity for blues music that, keeps him going. But this is where we get the first hint of his association with the devil, because it's actually after the death of his first wife that Virginia's relatives say that this is divine punishment for Robert choosing to sing secular blues songs as opposed to gospel songs, Christian songs in the South. You gotta remember, this is the early 1900s. There's this big Christian revival going on. Like, it leads to all the evangelical craziness today. And, they believe that singing should only be for their God or whatever, and that if you sing secular songs that you're doomed to hell. We gotta remember this is the mindset at the time. And this is actually where the phrase selling your soul to the devil actually comes from. It's Southern lexicon, it's Southern slang for a person who chooses to sing secular music as opposed to their gospel Christian music. So after the death of his first wife, And, all these people saying that, singing this blues is selling yourself to the devil. Robert Johnson, he kind of leaves the idea of being a sharecropping Southern farmer behind and focuses on becoming a blues musician, which I kind of get it if you come from a background of Southern poverty. That's kind of a good out. I mean, I kind of get it because I come from a background of, let's just say, trailer trash poverty. And if I had an out like music, if I was musically talented, I would seek that out too. However, I'm not musically talented. The only out I have is to work hard and to one day hopefully make money off of this dumb podcast. But I digress. So it's around this time, right after he loses his first wife, when the iconic blues legend himself, Son House, and if you know anything about blues, you know about Son House. I'm not going to go into it here, but the man is a legend, and you should totally listen to some of those albums. They are amazing. Anyways, he's hanging around Son House, and at the time, these are all itinerant singers. So they're singing in juke joints and on street corners and in barbershops and in dance halls and pretty much anywhere where they can gain an audience, bars and whatever you want to call it. And Robert Johnson, he's hanging around, and while at the time he was considered a good jaw harp player and harmonica player, even Son House said that he was an embarrassingly bad guitar player. And in between their sets, like Son House's sets and stuff, when they would go out, out back to like have a smoke or, what they called at the time catch air, Robert Johnson, he'd be playing and he would be so bad that the people in the juke joint or the dance hall or whatever would be like, say, you got to get off the stage, dude. Like, you're making a racket. This is terrible. Like, you're a terrible guitar player. What are you doing? Get out of here. And then Son House and Willie Brown and them, they'd all come back and do their set, and then he'd go off and, Robert Johnson go off and do his thing. So it's around this time where Robert Johnson actually kind of leaves the area. He's living in Robinsonville at the time, and he's looking for his birth father. That's what a lot of people think. They think he's gone to go try to find his birth father. And it's around this time where he meets another great icon of blues, Ike Zimmerman. Isaiah Ike Zimmerman. Now, Ike Zimmerman, he's also one of these legendary blues artists who you could say has a link to the supernatural, because it is said that Isaiah learned his craft by playing in cemeteries at night, and it was through these supernatural means of playing in these cemeteries at night where he got this ability to become a great guitar player. Now, the reality of the situation is, Robert Johnson and Ike Zimmerman, they would play their guitars at night in cemeteries. Now, while this could allude to some supernatural dealings, especially in the South, where you have, like some of that Southern Haitian voodoo influence and stuff, that could be playing into the legend. But in all reality, they're probably playing in these cemeteries at night because it's a quiet place with good acoustics where nobody would bother them, so they can really hone their craft. And it's really during this year or two where they're doing this where Robert Johnson returns to the scene. He returns to, he shows up and Son House is like, oh my God, this guy is a miraculous guitar player. How did he do this? And even though it was most likely through the teachings of Ike Zimmerman, this legend gets attached. The legend I'm going to go into now, the infamous Crossroads legend. So as we know, as a young man, Robert Johnson had a tremendous desire to be the greatest blues musician of all time. So while he was living near the Dockery Plantation in Mississippi, right around midnight, he was told to go out to the Crossroads and start playing his songs. Well, midnight comes and a large black man shows up. So Robert Johnson hands this man the guitar. He tunes it and he plays a song. He hands the guitar back to Robert. At that time, that was the deal. In exchange for his immortal soul, which the devil would come to seek at the age of 27 and condemn him to eternal hellfire, Robert Johnson would become the greatest blues musician of all time and lay the earliest foundations for what we know today as rock and roll, which we know eventually became every awesome genre you can think of. It led to punk rock, it led to metal, it led to like all the subgenres of metal. It's just, he lays all these foundations on this night at the Dockery Plantation in his early youth. And that is why many artists will say we sold our soul for rock and roll. Now, there are multiple sites today which claim to be the site. There's actually a famous tourist trap in Mississippi, but those aren't the Crossroads. The Crossroads are actually just outside the Dockery Plantation, which isn't actually too far from a cemetery, which is kind of funny. I think it's a private cemetery, I'm not sure. But that's where the Crossroads are. It's these dusty old roads, these dirt roads out in the middle of nowhere. And that's where the legendary deal supposedly took place. And this legend would be repeated by contemporaries at the time, most notably Son House. And while the legend does kind of gloss over the fact that he probably, with Ike Zimmerman as a teacher, worked really hard to become extremely competent at the guitar, it does become the primary legend that's attached to him of how he was able to master the guitar, because humans, we don't like simple, basic explanations. No, we like supernatural explanations. It just makes our life a little more intriguing, especially somebody like Robert Johnson, who, the last time you saw him, he was so embarrassingly bad, people were saying, hey, get him out of here, what the hell? And then just you see him again, and he's just a genius at the instrument that he was so embarrassingly bad at. Of course, you're not going to attribute that to just a boring explanation of like, well, he practiced really hard. Nah, you got to attribute that to the devil, because that's a better story. Of course, these stories of Johnson selling his soul at the Crossroads, it never really comes up during his lifetime. We start seeing it in the 1960s when blues historians are trying to piece together this guy's life. And a similar story, impossible origin story, actually comes from the artist Tommy Johnson, who was a Delta blues artist in the 1920s. And it was said that to enhance his fame, he cultivated a sinister persona, and his brother Liddell actually claimed that he had sold his soul at the Crossroads to the devil in exchange for the mastery of the guitar. Now, Tommy Johnson was never related to Robert Johnson. He actually was performing about 10 years before Robert Johnson was performing. However, this myth also gets attributed to Robert Johnson, probably just because of how history is. It gets kind of muddled. So you have these two different guys with a similar name who allegedly sold their soul to the devil at the Crossroads. And then you have the latter guy, Robert, who was at one point an embarrassingly bad guitarist and then becomes a great guitarist. That's how the legend kind of gets attached to him. And I think the reason why we see this myth get associated with Robert Johnson as opposed to where it began with Tommy Johnson was probably because Robert Johnson is just seen as a little more iconic. I mean, he does only record 29 tracks. He is very mysterious, and he does die at a fairly young age. Whereas Tommy Johnson, he goes on to become a popular performer throughout the 30s and 40s. He doesn't die till years and years later. And it's probably just kind of that way to sell books, I guess. Attach it to the more mysterious figure. But I digress. So back to the story at hand. So at this time, it's 1931. Robert Johnson returns, and he's this amazing guitar player. And it's around this time where he actually marries his second wife, Caletta Craft. They settle in Clarksdale, Mississippi in the Delta, but soon after, Johnson leaves for a career as a walking or itinerant musician. Claretta dies in 1933, probably childbirth or maybe syphilis. It doesn't really say in the history that I can find as why she died, but shortly after Robert Johnson is married for a second time, she dies within like a year or two. It's from the year 1932 up until his death in 1938, when Johnson is moving frequently between the cities of Memphis and Helena and all the smaller towns in that Mississippi Delta region. He's living as an itinerant musician, so he's bouncing around from juke joints to dance halls to little theaters to pretty much anywhere where he could get a gig as a player in one of these juke joints or whatever. Now, occasionally he would travel a little further than that. The blues musician Johnny Shines accompanied him to Chicago, into Texas, into New York, Canada, Kentucky, and Indiana. And the musician Henry Townsend shared a musical engagement with him in St. Louis. So he's bouncing around all over the place. And everywhere he's going, he's picking up girlfriends and lovers. While he never married again after his second wife died, he does become a bit of a womanizer. And it's said that everywhere he went, he had some female that he could shack up with for the time being. And what alludes even more to his mystery is while he's bouncing around, he's using different surnames everywhere he goes. Probably because a lot of these women he was shacking up with was married. And, he didn't want that husband, that angry husband, to come after him. That's just my personal opinion on the matter. If I were bouncing around from place to place, seducing every woman I could find, regardless of whether or not they were married, I'd probably be using different surnames too. And it shows that Johnson was a natural performer, because it was said that when he would arrive in a new town, he would play for tips on street corners in front of the barbershop or restaurant or whatever. And some of his musical associates said that in his live performances, he didn't focus on like the dark Delta blues, complex compositions, but instead he would please audiences by performing more well-known pop standards of the day. Not necessarily blues, but like jazz and country. He kind of had a natural ear for music, and he could pretty much pick up any kind of song that he heard just by listening to it, which is usually what we call in the music world is playing by ear. I kind of do that too. I play bass, and generally I only have to hear something a couple of times before I can get the general gist of the song in my mind. It was also said that he had a natural rapport with his audiences. In every town in which he stopped, he was able to make friends in the local community. So anytime they passed back through that local community, they would serve him well. They'd give him a place to crash. He'd give him food, give him money, whatever he needed. Women and booze, probably. He had a natural weakness for whiskey and women, but what red-blooded American male doesn't? But it would be in 1936 when he lands in Jackson, Mississippi. So a man named H.C. Spare, who ran a general store, was also acting as a talent scout. And he put Johnson in touch with a man named Ernie Ortel, who was a salesman for the ARC group of labels, introduced Johnson to Don Law to record his first session in Texas. He kind of bounced around, but you get it. He knows a guy who gets him a recording session in Texas, San Antonio actually. So they're in San Antonio, Texas, and they're in the Gunter Hotel in room 414. And from November 23rd, 1936 to November 25th, 1936, they do this 3-day session where Johnson plays 16 selections and recorded alternate takes of them. Among the songs that were recorded in this first session were Sweet Home Chicago, the infamous Crossroads Blues, which becomes a blues standard, Terrapin Blues, and The Last Fair Deal Gone Down, and Believe I'll Dust My Broom. Those are just some of the songs that came out of this first recording session. And it said that it went on to sell as many as 10,000 copies, which actually that's pretty awesome for back then. So the second session actually takes place in Dallas in a makeshift studio at the Vitagraph or Warner Brothers building. That takes place on June 19th through June 20th, 1937. Johnson records almost half of the 29 songs that make up his entire discography in Dallas, and 11 records from this session were released with the following year. You got to remember, these are 78s. 78 sold about 3 minutes per side. So, that's basically one song per side. So, naturally, 29, out of that half, you get about 11 records. So, most of the songs from this session were more somber and introspective songs and performances. He actually did 2 takes of these songs, with which the recordings actually still survive. And because of this, there's more opportunity to compare different performances of a single song by Johnson, which is pretty cool because most Delta blues guys of the era, they weren't really doing that. And in contrast to most Delta blues players, he actually got the idea that, hey, I should compress this to like one single, 3-minute recording, whatever I can get out of this, so it'll fit on one side of one of these 78 RPM records. So that's kind of cool that he kind of thought of that. Like, you got 3 minutes on this side of this record to record, so he thinks, yeah, maybe I should take this song that's only 5 minutes long and cut it down to 3. That's not really common back then, so, it just goes to show a little bit of his intelligence. However, after that, in 1938, Robert Johnson does die. He ends up dying on August 16th, 1938, at the age of 27 near Greenwood, Mississippi, of, quote, unknown causes. Now, this is the final, epic saga in the myth surrounding Robert Johnson, because he did die at such a young age and he died quite suddenly. So one myth that goes around was Johnson was playing at a country dance about 15 miles outside of Greenwood, Mississippi. He was staying at a plantation there, and another blues musician named Sonny Boy Williamson, who was there at the time, said that Johnson was flirting with a married woman at the dance, and she gave him a bottle of whiskey poisoned by her husband. Well, he took the bottle and Williamson knocks it out of his hand, and he says, "Don't ever drink an unopened bottle that was just handed to you. You don't know what's in it." Johnson brushes him away and says, "Don't you ever knock a bottle out of my hand." So the husband poisons another bottle and sends it to him, and he drinks it, and he dies in agony a few days later from what a lot of people think was strychnine poisoning. Now, several decades later, there's this blues historian named Robert Mack McCormick. He claims that he actually tracked down the man who murdered Johnson and obtained a confession from him. However, he declined to ever release that man's name. And it's kind of weird because it's like, okay, you track down the guy who killed the most iconic Delta blues player of his time, and you're not going to release that information. Even if the guy's dead, there's still no statute of limitations on murder. So it kind of alludes to whether or not he actually did track that man down, or if that story is even true to begin with. And of course, the whole strychnine idea is kind of disputed too, because strychnine, you can't really mask the odor or whatever, even if you do have some skunky old liquor or something. So some people actually think it was naphthalene from dissolved mothballs, which can kill you slowly too. And that was a common way of poisoning people in the rural South at this time. However, other people think that when he died, he actually died of syphilis, like an inherited form of syphilis, in the poor rural South, in a time a little bit pre-penicillin. Syphilis was generally a death sentence. Some people also believe that he may have had Marfan syndrome, and it could have been issues with that, with complications of syphilis, which may have killed him. We really don't know because his gravesite is a mystery. There's actually 3 different places that suggest to be his gravesite, and underneath each one of those, his body is not there. A lot of people believe that he was just dumped in a pauper's grave, shortly after death near the plantation where he died. And of course, there was no autopsy done. That's why the cause of death is unknown. But Johnson's ultimate legacy would outlast him. In his lifetime, he wasn't really seen. I mean, he had fans locally, but he wasn't like really an international sensation. But he did influence guys and influence other musicians who picked up what he was doing. And Johnson really laid those foundations of like the Delta blues, which led to other forms of blues, which eventually leads to rock and roll. He lays all these foundations, and those foundations are largely attributed to his infamous, quote, boogie bass pattern or boogie shuffle. It's a fifth, sixth degree of a major scale oscillation above the root chord. Or put even more simply, it's kind of like a driving bass beat on a guitar as opposed to like the piano. And that technique was really influential in the guitar styles that would come later, post World War II, even into the rock and roll era, etc. And it's actually in the 60s and 70s where they're piecing together his life and this mystery around his life, where they re-release his recordings, and those recordings take off and become, some of the best-selling albums of all time. And it's in that legacy where we can see that Faustian pact, that so-called deal with the devil, probably came to fruition. Might not have during his lifetime, but eventually it came to fruition afterwards, because he is considered one of the most iconic and greatest blues players to ever set foot on stage. And on that note, I think I'll end it here. This is Mike with Urban Legends and Mythology. And if you like what I do, I simply ask that you share this with a friend. Listen to it, spam their inboxes with my links. I spam you guys with my links all the time, so you shouldn't be missing episodes. Or if you want, you can always donate. I would really appreciate that. I don't really care if you do or not. It's just, I just thought I'd mention it because it is an option to support the podcast and the show. But I do thank you guys for listening, and I will see you in the next one, which I'm actually going to record right now because I'm on a tight recording schedule now, and if I want to start releasing these weekly, I have to step it up. Anyways, thank you. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.